Well, welcome everyone to the last of the 4 sessions on citizen planning that ALT is doing in conjunction with GrowSmart Rhode Island. I wanted to thank the Beuren Charitable Foundation for funding this series, which has gone to each of the communities to talk on a preliminary basis about land use, planning, and zoning in each community. And now this is a little bit more advanced of a presentation, which we call Next Steps, looking at some of the more innovative land use techniques and the process of implementation of those techniques. So welcome, and I will at this point turn it over to Scott Wolf to make a few opening remarks. Thank you. Scott, you're on mute. Scott, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Good evening, everybody. You can already tell I'm not the most technologically advanced person in Rhode Island, but I'm very pleased to be here and to be working with the Quinnipiac Land Trust, dynamic organization and terrific staff on this series. My name's Scott Wolf. I'm Executive Director of GrowSmart Rhode Island. And at a time when many of us are looking with a fresh eye at the future well-being of our communities, we're especially enthusiastic about partnering with ALT on this series. And before delving into the main topics and speakers for tonight's workshop, I want to introduce you briefly to GrowSmart Rhode Island and to go over workshop logistics for this evening. GrowSmart RI is a nonprofit policy research, advocacy, and land use training organization, and we're committed to making Rhode Island a place where every person benefits from vibrant neighborhoods and downtowns, from restored and protected natural resources, and from a just, thriving, and resilient economy. Ambitious goals, but important ones, we believe. And one of the major ways we pursue these critical goals is through our community land use training program, which has been around in some form for most of our 23 years of existence. The program has relied on exceptional volunteer land use professionals to deliver its workshops, and tonight's session is the latest example of that, thanks to several land use and planning gurus who will be presenting to you, including Nate Kelly of Horsley and Witten, and my own insightful and highly knowledgeable colleagues, Scott Millar and John Flaherty. Now on to some basic logistical information. Tonight's session, as you may have noticed just a few minutes ago, is being recorded, mainly so it can be accessed by people not able to tune in right now. And please stay on mute for the bulk of the session until our final Q&A discussion segment, when you can ask a question directly to any of our speakers. Your video will be on off until this final segment. And now let me tell you about the so-called run of the show. It's going to include in a minute a quick review by me of the potential benefits of some of the smart growth strategies and tools you'll be hearing more about shortly. After that, we will have 3 roughly 15-minute presentations from our experts. Scott Millar will lead off, outlining a variety of innovative strategies to maximize conservation of the island's incredible natural resources, especially its farmland and open spaces. Nate Kelly will follow, sharing his extensive knowledge about several different zoning reforms and policy reforms that can ensure quality compact growth in the parts of the island where growth is most desirable and sustainable. And then my colleague John Flaherty will back cleanup, or as close to cleanup as you can get with 3 people. And he'll be highlighting some of the exciting new ideas and investment possibilities emerging in Rhode Island to enhance our public transportation system and to facilitate transit-oriented and environmentally sustainable development. And then following these presentations, Chuck and I will moderate about a 20-minute Q&A discussion segment followed by brief concluding remarks from Chuck. During the whole workshop, we encourage you to enter questions and comments in the chat section, and we will address as many of these as possible when we get to the Q&A segment. So I just want to spend a few more minutes before I introduce our speakers talking about the potential benefits of key smart growth strategies and tools. And I think probably the most important point I can make is the first one, which is there is a lot that you as concerned citizens, in some cases perhaps local officials, can do to influence the location and the sustainability of both development and conservation on this extraordinary island. We're convinced, and I suspect most of you are as well, that growth, development, and conservation don't just happen organically and inevitably. They're each the result of a series of rules, regulations, decisions, and incentives that can tip the scales either for smart, compact, environmentally friendly development or towards unsustainable, haphazard, and wasteful, sprawling kind of development. And through this series, I hope a number of you have gained a deeper understanding of how development and conservation decisions are made at the local level. And so tonight, we're going to take the next logical step, which is focusing on how you can influence these decisions, learning more about the strategies and tools to get you and your communities the actual results that you want on the ground, so to speak. Our panel of experts will be discussing several federal, state, municipal programs and tools, both in existence and potential programs and tools that developers, community-based organizations, and municipal governments can use to maintain the exceptional character of Aquidneck Island while encouraging essential targeted sustainable growth on the island. Now, ideally, some of these strategies and tools will be implemented on a regional basis rather than just in one individual island community. I mean, Aquidneck Island really is a single, in many ways, ecosystem, a single economic marketplace, and not in reality just a series of siloed off communities. And when you think about transportation, when you think about water and sewer infrastructure, when you think about watersheds, and when you think about a comprehensive island-wide open space strategy that Aquidneck Land Trust has developed, you really need to think and act regionally. And there are some inspiring examples of regional cooperation, both on this island through ALT and others, as well as elsewhere in Rhode Island that are occurring. In the Blackstone Valley, you've got Pawtucket and Central Falls teaming up to have a joint commission to oversee the development of their train station and train district. I know on Aquidneck Island, there have been a number of regional studies and plans on transportation and other topics. So there is a lot that can and should be done regionally, especially with the complicated challenges that we face both on Aquidneck Island and in the rest of the state. From Scott Millar, you're going to be learning shortly how residential development can occur in a form that preserves most of the land where the development is located. And you'll also hear from Scott about a hot topic, which is how to accommodate new solar installations in ways that don't sacrifice our remaining precious farm and forest land. Nate Kelly next will outline some of the creative changes in zoning rules that you can advocate to produce more compact, efficient, and mixed-use development. And that's a form of development that can and should reduce development pressure on the island's open spaces and working landscapes. Ideally, this kind of mixed-use development incorporates housing, retail, transportation, and other key services in one walkable location, not spread out so vastly that you have to drive to get from one activity to another. There are examples, of course, of this development, including, I would say, the Broadway area of Newport, South County Commons, which some of you may be familiar with, and the Hope Artist Village in Pawtucket, just to name a few. Now let me give you a brief, I'm sorry, if I forgot to talk about what the other folks are going to be saying. And Nate's going to outline some of the creative, well, no, I already mentioned that, I'm sorry. From John Flaherty, you'll be learning more about the state's current plan to create a stronger, more user-friendly and integrated public transportation system, and how your input can shape the nature of these transportation enhancements on Aquidneck Island while better connecting the island to the rest of the state and region, which I know sometimes people don't want to do, but I think overall there's an acknowledgement that is in the best long-term interest of the island. John will also be discussing briefly complete streets. I think he's planning to do that, an approach to road redesign and construction that makes our streets more ped, bike, and transit friendly and less dominated by automobiles. So now let me give you a little bit more introduction of the speakers and their backgrounds. Scott Millar first, who has a wealth of experience in and knowledge about crafting land use strategies, incentives, and regulations that conserve farmland, forest land, and other key natural resources while accommodating appropriately scaled and sited development. Currently, Scott serves as our Manager of Community Assistance and Conservation. And prior to joining us, he had a very distinguished and lengthy career as a key official at the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, where he focused on regional watershed planning and innovative strategies for sustainable development and conservation. Scott also did a stint earlier in his career with the Rhode Island Planning Office. And he's not just designed innovative plans and strategies, but he's been on the front lines of implementing them for many years in a variety of roles in his town of Exeter, where he now serves on the planning board. He has a BS, a positive BS in natural resources from URI and an MS in wildlife biology also from URI. Next, Nate Kelly, who's an outstanding GrowSmart Rhode Island partner and planning thought leader, both in Rhode Island and regionally, currently serves as the principal planner for Horsley-Witten. Nate has more than 20 years experience in master planning, zoning, community engagement, and in developing specialized neighborhood and housing plans. One outstanding example of his work is when he led a sweeping multi-year regulatory reform effort in Groton, Connecticut that resulted in a lot of new funding for the community and new innovative development. Nate has a master's in urban and environmental policy from Tufts and a BA from Boston College. And last but not least, my longtime colleague and alter ego, John Flaherty, who currently is GrowSmart Rhode Island's Deputy Director. John's duties and talents are vast, and his duties include serving as our lead on all things related to improving both Rhode Island's and the region's transportation system. During John's GrowSmart career, he had an important extracurricular activity, serving as the chair of the North Smithfield Town Council. And earlier in his career, he served as a member of the North Smithfield Planning Board. Before joining GrowSmart Rhode Island, John had another thriving profession in the convention and marketing world, where he was vice president of sales and marketing for the Providence Warwick Convention and Visitors Bureau. John has a degree from URI, an undergraduate degree, and has also attended Carleton College and received a certificate from the Harvard Kennedy School's Executive Education Program for senior executives in state and local government. Now that's a mouthful. So we got a very good group of folks to enlighten us all, inspire us, and give us direction. It's my pleasure now to turn the program over to Scott Millar. So Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Give me a second to bring up my presentation. And that's not the slide I was looking for. This is too bad. I'm going to have to bear with me. You're getting a preview really fast. Okay. I'm going to be talking about smart growth and how it can be used by towns to conserve their community character and natural resources. As Scott mentioned, I spent the bulk of my career at the Department of Environmental Management, I've been doing this at GrowSmart of trying to advocate for more creative land use techniques that towns could use to accommodate growth, but again, to avoid unnecessary impacts. So let's just talk about some of the things that we're going to, these are some of the techniques, and there's a lot to talk about in a really short amount of time. So I'm going to be giving a quick summary of all of these. But first of all, conservation development, low impact development, village development, and how we could do smarter solar development. Now let's start with conservation development. It's it's a very creative land use techniques that allows a community to work very collaboratively with the landowner, with the developer, to guide growth to those areas on the parcel of land that are most appropriate to accommodate that growth. It has as a goal to preserve at least 50% of the land that could otherwise be developed as permanently protected open space that will be protected in perpetuity. Since one picture is worth 1,000 words, let me quickly show you how this might work. This is an existing site. It's in South Kingstown. It's a farmstead. It's an historic farmstead just west of URI on Route 138. Some of you might be familiar with this location. It's got an historic farmstead, beautiful scenic vistas from 138 into the parcel. It supports prime agricultural land. It has wetlands and stream complexes. The interspersion of open space and the forested areas provide very unique and important habitat. Now let's take a look at this parcel after it's been developed in a conventional way. Essentially, all of the character defining features I previously described are really irreversibly destroyed. And we tend to blame developers for this cookie cutter kind of land use pattern. But a key point I want to make, and hopefully you'll retain, it's not development itself that's really the concern. It's really how municipalities allow and require growth to occur that's really the issue. Because there's clearly a better way to accommodate the same number of homes on this parcel and protect the most important character defining features. And that's what I'm showing you here. This is the end result of conservation development. It uses a very objective site design process to determine where on this parcel it's most important and most effective to accommodate, again, the same number of houses that you saw in the previous slide, but only this time, over 50% of this parcel is being preserved in perpetuity, and clearly some of the most important site features will be preserved. So what are some of the advantages of conservation development? To really make this work, it has to be a win-win. So there are some very significant economic advantages. It can preserve land for towns without buying it. It reduces town service costs for roads and other infrastructure in a very significant way. And it really increases the value and the marketability of the site in general. There are some big economic advantages for the landowners, the developers. It can reduce construction costs by as much as 40%. A lot of that is in reduced road, site clearing. That's a very significant cost savings. It's been very well documented right here in Rhode Island that lots can sell 47% faster, and a conservation development lot is worth 17% more than a conventional lot in the same community. Again, that was based on a Rhode Island study. The National Association of Realtors found that conservation development can actually be 20 to 29%. Those lots are more valuable than a standard conventional subdivision. So there's clear economic advantages. There's a long list of environmental advantages. I'm not going to go through all of these, but suffice to say, if you're only accommodating growth with conventional subdivisions, it's going to be very challenging to have that development and not result in some impacts to the environment. So conservation development also helps meet the requirements for low impact development in the DEM stormwater permit. It does this, for those of you who may not be familiar with low impact development, or LID, it's really a more creative way to accommodate stormwater runoff management by encouraging the infiltration of stormwater as close as possible to the point precipitation hits the ground. So it emphasizes trying to maintain pre-existing hydrology, trying to maintain as much open space as reasonable, so so water can infiltrate into that open space. It also tries to encourage guiding development away as far as reasonably that you can away from wetlands and surface waters. So let me demonstrate how conservation development can meet those objectives. When I was at DEM, this was an actual subdivision that came in a number of years ago. It's a very large parcel. It's about 140 acres. They're going to create about 24 lots. The blue area that you're seeing on here are wetlands. And this is fairly common. The developer wants to get the maximum amount of development from their property. So they're proposing roads that are going to be going right through wetlands. As you can also see, the wetlands are delineated, the lots are delineated in such a way that about 24 lots are going to contain some portion of wetland. And DEM has very effective regulations. We can initially approve a subdivision like this and make sure that the home is going to be outside of the wetland. But what happens over time, and many times this is inadvertent, the landowner, the person who buys this house lot, doesn't know where the wetland boundary is, and they inadvertently extend their lawns, their backyards, outbuildings, swimming pools, you name it, into the wetland, compromising the functions and values of those wetlands and ultimately degrading them. So what we try to do in conservation development, wherever possible, is pull those lot lines out of the wetland to avoid the temptation of people impairing them over time. And that's what this slide is showing you. Again, same number of house lots that you saw in the previous slide, only now we're using the conservation development approach to reduce the lot sizes. Here we've completely avoided any impacts to the wetlands in perpetuity. Now let's take a look at the comparisons. The conventional was going to create 24 lots with a portion of that lot area being wet, versus the conservation development will have none. The average lot size in the conservation development, in the conventional, was 3 acres. We've reduced that to about a ½ acre. The street length has been reduced significantly. It's over a mile of pavement that the developer doesn't have to build. The town doesn't have to operate and maintain that mile of pavement over time. Again, big cost savings. And look at the open space, which is just remarkable difference. Negligible amount of open space in the conventional subdivision. Over 82% of this parcel can be permanently protected. Big difference. Now, conservation development is thought as being most germane in rural and suburban communities. This is showing you a slide from Woonsocket, where they use this same concept, only incorporating multifamily and duplexes to increase density. And they've also incorporated low and moderate income housing into this development. I think it's a great example. One of these units you're looking at is a low and moderate income housing unit, but you can't tell the difference. They all look the same. They did a really nice job of doing this. And here's the end result. They were able to permanently preserve over 10 acres in Woonsocket, where access to open space is really at a premium. This was really a creative use of this technique. Now I'd like to show you how this technique can be used and has been used by towns like North Kingstown to sort of connect open space in order to avoid having little islands of open space that aren't connected to anything. They've been able to have continuous corridors of open space that run through their town. The purple area is showing you that area that the town went out and bought. The good news is about 24% of North Kingstown is permanently protected, or at least it was approximately 5 years ago. The orange on this slide is showing you that land that was protected using conservation development. And that's 40% of the total open space in the town of North Kingstown was protected without buying it. And as you look carefully, they've been able to string together in a linear fashion this open space. So it can be used for hiking trails, biking trails, and it's extremely valuable for wildlife corridors. And all of this is described in a lot more detail in a Rhode Island Conservation Development Guidance Manual, something I worked on a number of years ago when I was at DEM. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits of villages. I think this is a technique that can also be used to help preserve your community character and your farms in Aquidneck Island. Here's an illustrative example of a farm. This happens to be in Exeter. Again, this is the kind of development pattern that the area is actually zoned for. But there's an alternative use. Instead of just putting in residential development, this could be a mixture of uses, creating actually a new village area where you have a mixture of perhaps retail, institutional uses, as well as residential. There's actually more development in this slide than there was in the previous slides, and this actually contributes more significantly to the tax base. So what are some of the advantages of a village? Well, it can certainly help to protect your natural areas. It can provide homes for people of all stages of their lives. And a village can support economic growth and increase the tax base. And there's a really good example in South County Commons. Some of you might be familiar with this in South Kingstown. These numbers are for about almost 10 years old, but nonetheless, it still shows the economic benefits. At the time, you can see they had a mixture of office, retail, and they had as many as 460 residential units. They were still able to determine they had a net revenue of $1.3 million annually. There's been more development at this location since these numbers were done, so that number has only gone up. And there's a lot more information about this. This is Village Guidance, Tools and Techniques for Rhode Island Communities, something I worked on again when I was at DEM. There's a lot more information in here about how to go about that. Now I'd like to chat a little bit about smarter solar siting. And I really need to start off with Rhode Island solar siting programs. It's unfortunate they had very good intentions, but there's been some unintentional consequences that have really resulted in some bad results at the local level. So what are some of those unintended consequences? Well, it's been encouraging development of important natural areas in most Rhode Island cities and towns. Solar is very aggressively outcompeting open space preservation and housing. There's been a number of cases where local land trusts and others were working very diligently to try to preserve an area, only to have the landowner outbid, if you will, by a solar developer to develop the land as a solar farm. Unfortunately, that's happened several times. It's created some very severe community character conflicts that I'm sure you're all fully aware of. And the big one here is it's creating an incentive to develop farms and forests, and forest loss in particular is really counterproductive in managing climate change, because the forest is really the only way we can absorb and store the very high levels of carbon that are already in the atmosphere. It's the only practical and economic way to do that. As good as solar and wind power are, they have no ability to reduce the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So the key objectives that we encourage that towns address in their solar ordinances, it's really simple. And every town has to do that in a way that makes sense for them. But you need to encourage solar in developed and disturbed areas and really discourage it in areas where you don't want it, so you can avoid and reduce the loss of farms, forests in your natural areas. There's a lot of ways to do that. I unfortunately don't have the time to get into the details tonight, but we're actually working on some guidance that we think could be much more effective than the state guidance that's already out there, and talk about some of the best practices that are working well in other towns. So this is very quickly some of the preferred locations. These are your developed and disturbed areas. They're landfills, rooftops, solar canopies, and parking lots, which we think has tremendous potential in Rhode Island. It's really more effectively using a developed area that really more effectively. GrowSmart was, with other partners, lobbied very aggressively to encourage the state to establish a pilot program to give solar canopies an incentive to build, because they are more expensive. We're pleased that that's been funded for several years, but unfortunately, it's not clear if the state is going to continue that pilot program, which is a concern. Clearly, solar canopies make a lot of sense for Rhode Island. And also brownfields, business and industrial zones, and existing fields, but not prime agricultural soils, can also be preferred locations for solar development. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're going to be addressing questions at the end, but if you have a question and you don't get a chance to have it addressed, please don't hesitate to contact me. And there's my email at GrowSmart. Thank you so much.
Scott, great presentation as always, and let's segue right to Nate.
All right, thank you very much, Scott and Scott. See if I can get my presentation up here. Okay. Hopefully folks can see this. So my presentation is a bit of a grab bag of different issues. And with the common thread here of just, where are the areas of reform been, or where are the new issues coming forward, more on the development side, as Scott Wolf mentioned earlier, that is more of my focus, not the preservation side, but the, sort of the better development side. And so I will just walk right through sort of a potpourri of issues here and try to give a quick overview and tee us up for discussion later. What many of you are aware of, and what we're hearing again and again, is this issue of, I've called it the housing situation here. And you'll hear it often referred to as Rhode Island's housing crisis. And Rhode Island is certainly not alone with regard to this issue of affordability, where the demand for housing at certain price points simply cannot be met with the market that we have. Some of this has to do with land availability. Some of this has to do with the zoning issues that Scott Millar introduced recently. But this particular resource that I have up here on the screen is really something you all should consider taking a look at. This is the Housing Fact Book that comes out from Housing Works RI every year, and it looks at every municipality individually, but also, as you can see in the middle there, sort of regionally how things are operating. And it really is the foundation for what I think is some great data-driven discussion. So for those of you who are, want to be sort of the citizen planner advocate type, being armed with this kind of information can be extremely helpful. Short-term rental is obviously on a lot of people's minds. I generally tend to, I think the word disruptive is used a lot, is overused in the discussion of different economic issues, but this has certainly been a disruptive issue on many levels, economically, for neighborhoods, for individual cities and towns. And it's evolving still quickly with many communities in Rhode Island trying to get a handle on this, Newport being out front early and fast. If you take the time to look at the program, there's a great webpage on the city of Newport. You quickly realize how complex this issue is. You're dealing with zoning issues, but you're also dealing with enforcement issues that go outside of zoning in terms of complaints and enforcement and those things. So where and how this gets regulated, the different standards, it's really very surgical. And so I recommend folks take a look at how the city of Newport has done things because they've really taken it on head on. The city of Providence is an example of a city that's taking a much more sort of laissez-faire approach to it with a lot easier sort of a registration model. So there's two different ways that you can take a look at in some of our major cities within the state. Mixed-use zoning is something that is critical to, I think, the success of smart growth. Scott will talk a little bit about the kinds of communities that smart growth envisions occurring. And we not only have the challenge of zoning correctly for new developments, but we have to often zone within environments that have already been built, that have historic buildings. We have to infill and reuse and fit buildings onto lots that don't necessarily conform with the suburban style standards that have been in place. But the good news is that folks have been working on this for decades now, trying to sort of right the ship on the blunt instruments that have been part of zoning since the early 20th century and get much more sophisticated so that we can have a process that's predictable and also creates a great product. And you can see some of the photos here of very different scales. Mixed-use zoning can be anything from a 2-story to a 20-story building, depending on the environment. So it's really appropriate for every community in Rhode Island to be considering some scale of mixed use, and then to dig into your zoning in a way that really gets into the nitty-gritty on some of these things so you can get the product that you're looking for. Incentives and mitigation. Rhode Island, I think, is starting to dabble in this in a way that's more meaningful. And there's been no shortage of incentive programs, more for the urban environments. But as the housing crisis, continues to get worse, we understand that there may need to be incentives for rural, suburban, and urban areas alike to do this. And Rhode Island's been looking northward to Massachusetts to their Chapter 40R program. And so we'll share the resources for that. But this is a program that literally provides cash incentives to communities who switch their zoning to something that allows for greater density, for a greater mix of smaller multifamily units at specified densities. And if the community adopts the zoning, they get upfront cash simply for adoption, and then continued payments based on the occupancy permits that go into place. And pursuant, consistent with the previous slide, there's a lot of design consideration that goes into this. An accompanying piece that went with the legislation known as 40R is their 40S legislation, where a lot of communities kept, bringing forward the classic objection. Well, what about our schools? What about our schools? This is, you can give us the cash incentives, but it's not going to be enough to deal with the long-term issue of our schools being overrun by all the families and the children that are going to move in. And so 40S was put into place and set up a formula whereby municipalities, if they could demonstrate that there was a disproportionate impact from these developments, they would be compensated for that as well. And Rhode Island has followed suit on this particular aspect and adopted its own sort of mitigation piece to go with potential school children impacts. Does not have the more ambitious 40R component to it, but at least is moving in that direction, we hope. This is a very common term you're going to hear, maybe as budding citizen planners and advocates. This idea of missing middle housing was coined by this group, Optic Coast Design, and has really been used quite a bit because it captures this really interesting and common issue with zoning. A lot of communities allow for single family, just about every community allows for single family residential, and some communities do it across 70 to 80% of their land area. And many communities will also have the ability to put in multifamily developments. But again, it's a very blunt approach to looking at housing just from those two types. And what the missing middle discussion shines a light on is that there really is such a variety of wonderful housing types that can fit into so many different environments and be designed in ways that are really beautiful and fit into rural and suburban and urban environments alike. And these are sort of the missing middle in between the multifamily and the single family allowances. This whole range of quadplex, multiplex, townhouse, cottage, these types of housing options. And so South Kingstown, for example, is really looking at this issue very closely and is looking to develop it. I think they're all set on their cottage ordinance, so that's been adopted, but now they're going to look at manor houses, what they call manor houses and village apartments and townhomes, and develop specific allowances for those. So the zoning ordinance is just getting more specific and more sophisticated to allow for a wider variety of housing types in a way that the community is very comfortable with. The state historic tax credits, this is, I will say, this is an issue that Scott Wolf can talk circles around me on, but I will at least get the ball rolling here. This was put into place quite a while ago and really came out of the gate very strong. Many applications, many projects completed, and many were in the pipeline when the program was pulled. And perhaps it was a little too successful. Perhaps there was some misinformation, but for many years, organizations like GrowSmart Rhode Island found themselves advocating for the reinstatement of this program, and it has been reinstated. So we are in a position now where where communities can look to avail themselves of a pretty amazing program that looks to historic buildings for adaptive reuse. This is the Lyman Mill in North Providence as an example, but there have been projects at a number of different scales. I mean, this is obviously a really big one, but there have been projects at a number of different scales, moderate, it really just gets down to the historic value of the building itself, and then the content of the proposal to see if it's eligible for some really significant credits. Tax increment financing. So for those of you who have not heard of this term, or maybe you've heard of it and you're not quite sure what it means, this is a tool that's available to municipalities in Rhode Island, and it has been for a while. And again, for a little history, when this was first adopted, it was enormously complicated. And I think East Providence may have been the only community to avail itself of that generation of tax increment financing. But it truly was rocket science to get that off the ground, and took an enormous amount of work. It was amazing that it even happened. Thankfully, looking to other communities, the program was revised. It is expanded in terms of its reach. It is streamlined in terms of its implementation. And this allows for significant upfront investment and then the assessed value property, as that climbs, the money goes back into paying for that. So the taxes that are generated from the increase in property value are reinvested for a period of time in paying for those investments. So it sort of folds back in on itself and pays for major significant investments that might otherwise just not be feasible for the developer. This particular photo is from a visualization of what's to come in the city of Pawtucket, with the soccer stadium on the left and all sorts of mixed-use development surrounding the river. And this is part of, I guess, what is being called a super tip. So not only will the local assessments be folded back in to help pay for this, but the state passed special legislation where the state coffers, they're gonna slice a piece off of the state coffers to help pay for this, just recognizing the enormous magnitude of this particular development proposal, what's required to get this off the ground, but the long-term benefit for the city and the state as a whole. And lastly, what I want to introduce here is, advances in municipal infrastructure funding. The Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. So this is, again, just another key resource here that I want to introduce. For those of you who are not familiar with the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and you're really interested in how your community is going to develop, take some time to go through this website. This is an organization that's been around for a while, but it really seems like over the last 5-8 years, it's really kind of taking off. I think it was in place to manage some very conventional revolving loans that have been around forever, but all of a sudden it's really doing some innovative things. It has a stormwater accelerator program where it's seeding and paying for green infrastructure, as it's known. So you see here these pictures, the one with the crane in it is a really large development that became an athletic field in Central Falls, which treats an enormous amount of stormwater before it gets into the river, the Blackstone River up there. And then right below that is a very modest application of green infrastructure, where you see a very small sort of corridor of plantings here that actually treats stormwater coming off this road. So very different scales of things. But beyond stormwater, to the left, you have a wastewater treatment plant that was that benefited from the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank funding. And to the right, a recent story about how the commuter rail that's going to open on the Pawtucket Central Falls line also benefiting from the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. And most recently, John Flaherty and others from GrowSmart and other advocates have been, pointing again north to the Mass Works infrastructure program, very successful program in Massachusetts that is financing key infrastructure projects. A lot of the great ideas that the planners come up with in the state really have a tough time getting off the ground if key infrastructure investments aren't made, and the developers can't handle that in their pro forma, and the municipalities can't handle that in their budgets. And so having a sort of state level fund that can come in and close that gap has been super helpful up in Massachusetts. This fund was passed several years ago and not funded. It was established but not funded. And now I believe we have $1 million in that fund, and that is being managed again by the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. So this particular agency, this organization is really stepping up and playing a key role in creating more sustainable infrastructure for our cities and towns. So I'll stop there and pass it back to you.
Nate, thanks. Excellent presentation and a very concise overview of a lot of potentially impactful tools. It's just one quick point I want to make before turning it over to John is that while we have access to a lot of these pretty innovative tools, what often prevents them from being utilized effectively is a lack of staff capacity at the municipal level. Most of our planning departments are understaffed. We have very good planners in our state, but we don't have enough of them in most of our municipal planning departments. And so what tends to happen is the municipal planners tend to be in a reactive mode as opposed to a mode where they're looking at long-term opportunities to have some game-changing kinds of creative development. So I think all of us should be advocating for more funding for good planning and economic development specialists at the local level. With that, I'm going to turn it over to a outstanding planning and economic development specialist, and especially a transportation specialist, my colleague, John Flaherty. So John, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. And thanks for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics. So what we've heard so far has been very compelling. And I think that for most people here, there's no question that proactively shaping the relationship between transportation, development, and land use is really vital to the goals that are set out in the Aquidneck Land Trust report. And tonight, I'm actually here to say that there's never been a better time for mobilizing action than right now when it comes to the transportation component of this equation. And so whether we're talking about our public transportation system, whether we're talking about active transportation, complete streets, or transit-oriented development, there's a lot happening. And starting off with money from Washington, D.C. There's a bill pending right now in the Congress. We hope that they get it done, and they get it done soon. I'm speaking about the $1 trillion infrastructure package that would become available to advance these transportation goals. So as it stands right now, that $1 trillion package includes the largest federal investment in transit in the history of our country. So there's certainly opportunity for moving that ball forward. Second is that you in Aquidneck Island already know what to do. You've been at this for a while, and you've got some great tools already at your disposal. Although the transportation study that you see on the left, it's about 10 years old. It's packed with excellent guidance for all communities to guide their transportation investments. And it's also there's numerous references in the transportation study to how to do transit-oriented development thoughtfully and to take advantage of that investment. When it comes to complete streets, again, you know what it looks like. You've done it on Aquidneck Island. You know what good design is. You know how it works. We just need to be doing more of it. So on Aquidneck Island, each of the communities have already, about 10 years ago, they each passed a council resolution in support of the benefits of complete streets. It's different. A resolution is different than codifying it as an ordinance. But just last week, City of Newport passed the Greening Complete Streets Ordinance. So now it's got some teeth to it, and it also has some longevity beyond the sitting council that may have passed a previous resolution. And I know that in the case of both Middletown and Portsmouth, they have, so Newport was the third community in Rhode Island to pass a Green and Complete Streets Ordinance. Central Falls was the first. That was about 2018. City of Providence just passed one last month, and Newport was the one that just came through last week. So increasingly, communities, the elected officials in communities are hearing from people. They understand that this is important. They understand what it can achieve for the community, and they're coming on board for it. And then when we talk about transit-oriented development, there are actually in every single municipality on Aquidneck Island, there are plans either underway or that have been contemplated for transit-oriented development, mixed-use districts. This one that you see in the background is the north end of Newport. In Middletown, again, this was just last month that the council adopted a zoning ordinance to create a seaside village in Middletown. And it may have been a while ago, but I know that Portsmouth has also put a lot of time and effort into the idea of creating a town center along East Main Road. So there's already some momentum there, which I think is fantastic. And now there's an opportunity to really juice it with the transportation that's critical to the success of these projects. So how best to actually put these federal dollars to work? We are in the enviable position in Rhode Island to have the state's first ever statewide transit vision and master plan. It was adopted just a short time ago in December of 2020. That was part of the state's long-range transportation plan. Along with that was the adoption of a statewide bicycle mobility plan, also very important for these, if we're talking about town centers and about how to have better mobility options for more people. And actually at this time, I want to try a little test, and it will require you typing into the chat box. And it's only 2 questions. So feel free to go ahead and put your, I'm gonna look for where I can monitor the chat. Here we go. And my question is, what percent of Rhode Island's population currently do you think lives within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop in Rhode Island? Just take a guess, any guess, just a percent. What percent of the state's population do you think lives within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop? Okay, we see 15%, 30%, 20, any others? 50, good, Nate, close. 77% of Rhode Island's population lives within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop. All right, my second question, what percent of the state's population do you believe uses transit as a means to commute to work? Knowing that there's almost 80% of the state's population that lives within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop. How many use it? Nate says 10, Melissa says 15. Terry Flynn, getting much closer. The number is 2.5%. That's a really big spread. We've got this system that has the bones for really being a fantastic transit system for the state. But if you think about it, people who have a choice will make the rational choice for how they're going to get from point A to point B. And in order to do that, the system has to be convenient, it has to be efficient, it has to be attractive, it has to get you where you're going, when you need to get there, and get you home. And unfortunately, as much as we love RIPTA and we have a good transit system, it gets a lot of people where they need to go, 81% of the current RIPTA ridership does not have access to a car. Which leaves very few people who are using it as an option. So for me, for example, I'm in the office now. For me to go home, there's not enough service to get where I have to go. So I'm going to have to take a bus to Woonsocket and then arrange to get picked up. And so that's not really how a rational choice about how you get from point A to point B occurs. And yet we've got the bones for it. So fortunately, for Rhode Island. We've got this, this transit vision and master plan at the very time that the federal government is about to make unprecedented levels of investment in transit across the country. So I think that puts us in a really good position to qualify for maximum funding to get this thing implemented and to accelerate it. This is envisioned as a 20-year plan. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are in the transit master plan that you should be aware of. So it calls for approximately doubling the amount of service that's on the street. That's probably the first and foremost thing that RIPTA could do if it had the resources to drive up ridership, is to put more frequency on the road so you don't have to wait as long for your if you're taking it up and down Aquidneck Island, your ability to get home is going to be affected by the hours of service. Do they cut the service off at 9 p.m.? Do you work a second shift job? What about weekends? I talked about the use of transit for commuting to work. The reason we know that is because that's a US Census number that we can track. However, most transit trips are not taken for commuting to work purposes. They are for people running errands, going shopping, visiting their family, all the things that you normally would get in your car to do. And so it's not just for going to work. And on the weekends, the service is significantly reduced. In fact, on Sundays, the service is less than half of what it is during the week in terms of frequency and hours of service. So that puts a real damper on people's ability to use transit as a reliable way to get where they're going. And it's my hope that we're going to be addressing that. Rhode Island is the second most urbanized state in the country after New Jersey. So that really speaks to having the bones for a really good transit system. And a lot of this, by the way, you will see, even though this transit master plan was developed in 2020, if you go back and look at that Aquidneck Island transportation plan from 10 years ago, you'll see many, many references to how the island can make better use of public transit. But of course, it's dependent upon having a level of service that works for more people. So I mentioned hours of service. I mentioned increased frequency. I mentioned amenities. This is something that, you've probably driven up and down East Main Road and seen nothing more than a sign on a telephone pole that signals it's a bus stop. And it's not really the kind of passenger amenities that's going to attract more people to use the system. So having better bus stops with amenities, with real-time bus information on them, a place to actually get shelter if it's raining. These are all the things that contribute to people's decisions, the people who do have a choice about how they're going to get from point A to point B. Those are all the things that really influence whether they think it's for them. And so along those lines, I wanted to talk about one of the other components. How come my thing isn't, let's see if it's not advancing here. Here we go. So one of the components that you should be aware of at the municipal level in the transit master plan, which by the way would come with funding. So this is one other example of something that a city or town can pursue without having to try to figure out how they're going to pay for it, is a network of mobility hubs across the state. Now, these mobility hubs are places in a community where you can transfer from bus to a zip car or to a car or to a bike share program or scooter share if you have that. Again, this kind of thing is done at the scale of the community. So not every mobility hub has every one of these elements, but it is a place where it brings together multiple modes of transportation that add a level of convenience, and also in some cases would provide a facility in which you could wait if it was cold or it's raining. It may be an indoor facility, but it's critical that municipalities partner with RIPTA, because RIPTA is not going to just come in and put them wherever they think that they're going to be best suited. They're going to want to work with municipalities, as in fact, they're already working with municipalities. I've spoken with RIPTA. I know they're dealing with about a half dozen communities that have approached them who are very interested in working on the development of these mobility hubs in the community. So here's the map that shows where RIPTA thinks that they may be best suited based on their route information, but these are just sort of draft points on a map. RIPTA is not coming into any community and doing something without collaborating with the community, but these are examples of where they see mobility hubs occurring. And you'll notice the red ones, I'll actually zoom in a little bit here closer on Aquidneck Island. The red ones would be regional mobility hubs that may have a higher level of amenity. They may have more services there, like Zipcar or scooters and such. And then you have local mobility hubs. So this represents one area where communities can collaborate with RIPTA, and I would strongly encourage anybody who is inclined to want to be an advocate for improving transportation to encourage your community to collaborate with RIPTA on trying to get these implemented. And then finally, RIPTA has put together this bus stop design guide. So for communities that would like to have, a bus stop that's more than just a sign on a telephone pole, but you really want to embrace transit and encourage more people to use it. There's fantastic guidance for your local planning department to use in determining the most appropriate places for bus stops, for more advanced or more elaborate bus stops and some of these mobility innovation hubs. So I'm going to end it there because I want to preserve as much time as we can for conversation. I apologize that I didn't include my contact information, but we're going to be sending follow-up emails to everybody who's participating with a list of resources, including the ones that you see on the screen here, and links to them. So you don't have to take many notes, or you don't have to worry about going to look for it online. We're going to provide a document that will have links to all this information for you. Thanks very much.
John, thanks. And Chuck, I guess now, excellent presentation as always. And we're at a period I think you can all see when there are a lot of opportunities to promote smarter growth and sustainable development. And but it's critical that folks like you who are concerned about these issues get involved. So Chuck, I think now we are open for questions and discussion.
So are we opening it so that people can ask questions in Zoom, or do they need to do the chat box?
I think they can do either. Jillian, can you guide us a little bit on that?
Yes, absolutely. Anybody should be able to raise their hand to ask a question, and or if you prefer, type it in the chat box. We can read it for you.
And Jillian, when you say raise your hand, for some of the people of my generation, you may need to tell them how to do that.
Just like this is good.
Well, that or they can do it through the mechanisms at the bottom of the screen, right?
Yep, there's a little button that says reactions, and under there, there's a button that says raise hand. So you can raise your hand to indicate you want to speak.
And will their video be available now?
I believe so. I believe if you can choose to turn your video on.
And unmask you all.
Come on in the room.
Well, I think there was a question in the chat from earlier.
Yes.
Talking about question for Scott Millar. Where are we? Do you have any examples of using public schools for rooftop solar? Are there any grants or other funding sources for such projects?
The short answer is yes. I know the Office of Energy Resources has been working very closely with municipalities, school districts in particular, to see if they'd be interested in hosting solar, either on the roofs or even potentially in a carport situation. If you're interested in that further, someone to connect with would be Christopher Kearns at the Office of Energy Resources, and he can provide more specific information.
Right. Someone, yeah, Chuck, you had asked about organize efforts to create legislation similar to Massachusetts's 40R and 40S. And I saw John replied about the 40S version. How about the 40R version?
I'll say quickly that there are currently 2 active commissions working on potentially big ticket legislative items. So there is a low mod income housing commission that is discussing potential revisions to that piece of legislation, which has the comprehensive permit associated with it. So it's a piece of legislation that allows for developers to potentially circumvent local zoning where communities do not have 10% of their stock as deed restricted affordable. I did forget to mention in my presentation that 40R does have an affordability component to it. So the low mod income housing commission that is meeting now, and those meetings can be viewed by the public, and they will have opportunities for public comments. This is the kind of thing that they will entertain, and they're aware of it. They know about it. So the more people push for it, the more they may be inspired to take it on. The other commission that is a little bit behind them in terms of schedule and will be working for a longer period of time is the broader land use commission. So Representative Shikarchi has pulled together a commission, and I'm on that commission, and we will be working well into 2022 to look at the full array of legislation that pertains to subdivision and zoning, and potentially some other items that deal directly with land use. So that is another platform where this idea of something like a 40R could be advocated for.
So Nate, I have a further question on that, which is with respect to 40R, does 40R take away local zoning jurisdiction like you're talking about?
It does not. It is local zoning jurisdiction.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've had a lot of legislation proposed that takes away local zoning jurisdiction and puts that jurisdiction with somewhere in the state, like statewide planning. And I'm not really a fan of that, because I think that local communities need to have buy-in on these projects. But I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on whether you see that a lot going forward.
Seeing which going forward?
Seeing provisions that take away local zoning jurisdiction as a way of expediting development.
I don't know that I've heard anything beyond what's already in place, which, as I mentioned, is the comprehensive permits, the affordable housing piece. I have not heard of any other efforts to take away local control. It doesn't mean that some won't advocate for it, but I don't know that there is a lot of traction in that area.
I think what's more prevalent and probably more politically sensible is providing more incentives like 40R for communities to be creative and to not just stagnate when it comes to their approach to land use.
All right, we have a question about large-scale solar farms. Who has done them well and why?
There's a lot of good examples of large-scale solar farms on brownfields, landfills, rooftops, solar canopies. These probably have the least conflict at the local community level. They typically are supported broadly by citizens, and it's a more efficient use of an already developed or disturbed space. So it really makes a lot of sense.
And GrowSmart RI actually awarded the city of East Providence and a developer, a solar developer, an award for their solar project on a city or former city landfill a number of years ago. And I believe that's on our website as one example.
I would offer that the town of Burrillville is doing a very good job. So an example of a very rural community that doesn't really have the opportunity to do, large scale rooftop applications and, that sort of thing. And I will just say, so I'm a consulting planner. So I've worked in, probably 25 of Rhode Island cities and towns. And I am always impressed with Burrillville, a community that has a reputation for being, very libertarian and sort of, no government intervention type thing. Their approach to their accomplishments in the areas of affordable housing, adaptive reuse, solar implementation, village scale development have been outstanding. And their approach is, just a lot of good planning, a lot of great community discussion, and, a sort of an open-mindedness to, things that, other communities get very anxious about. So I would encourage folks who are looking for rural examples of, how to do this sort of compact development, solar, affordable housing, all of these things in that type of environment, that Burrillville's done some great work.
I noticed, folks, that's another question in the chat. How can we influence Portsmouth officials to limit the number of national chain stores from moving in? Anybody want to tackle that hot potato?
I can talk about some of the tools that other communities have used. And I don't have really good data on this, but we work with economic professionals who do. I will say that I think it is in the community's best interest to limit your openness to major large chains, because I think their power is waning, their economic viability is waning. So too many eggs in that basket is a recipe for trouble. But there are regulatory tools in terms of limiting the footprints of buildings is a very direct way of doing it. If you want to sort of leave the door open, that's when you get into the design piece, because a lot of the major sort of national chains, some of them are willing to play ball in terms of giving high quality design and incorporating themselves into mixed use environments and doing that sort of thing. And some of them aren't. So that may be another way to go at it, is to say, okay, if you're willing to give us the type of experience that we want, then we will consider, having you come here. And if not, then you can look someplace else. So it all depends on, how direct I think you want to be about it.
So one of the, I think two of the most common objections to development, especially in suburban communities, is increased traffic and increased number of kids in the schools. Therefore, costing the community more than it's gaining from tax revenue. And we've covered that last one to some extent. But do any of our panelists want to talk about this constant refrain of traffic is going to increase dramatically? And my sense is that traffic only has to increase dramatically if you've got lousy design and if you've got single use versus mixed use approach to development. But what are you?
I'll jump in just quickly, Scott. I know we have another hand up, but just to say that I probably didn't get into some of the community benefits as much as I should have around the transit system. One of which is having an impact on limiting traffic.
Right.
And the other relates to climate change. For those who don't know, the transportation sector is both the single largest and the fastest growing contributor to climate emissions. And that number is only continuing to increase. The vehicle miles traveled and the related emissions. So having a really good transit system that provides an option for people to go from maybe being a 3-car household to a 2-car household, or a 2 to a 1. Not saying give the car up, we're not anti-car at all, but if people can rely more on public transportation because it actually does get them where they're going quickly and efficiently and easily, that can have dramatic impacts on reducing emissions. With that, I think I'll turn it to, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Is it Bevan?
Bevan, you're on mute.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yes, Bevan, thank you, thank you. So a different direction for this question in the 7 remaining minutes. So it's a big question for the last of the day. I was very glad to hear recognition of concern about the loss of farmland and food production, and somewhat disappointed that there has not been any representation of solutions to food production that is regional, particularly in light of climate change and the recent food supply chain disruptions. So I'm thinking of things like clustered developments around small farm nuclei, and wondering if there's been some consideration of those kinds of plans.
I could talk about that briefly. There's been a very successful project in Tiverton that integrated a conservation development with food production and preserving a farm. So that's been done. It appears to be working very well. They've won a number of awards for their design and their project implementation. Another means to get at food production is repurposing perhaps old abandoned retail. Other areas that aren't currently being used are old malls, etc., for producing food closer to where it might be consumed, in greenhouses that can run 24/7, powered by renewable energy. There have been some proposals in Rhode Island, although I think they're better served not being on prime farmland, so we can preserve our remaining farms for continued agricultural food production, because we can't grow everything in a greenhouse. But there's some good examples of greenhouse production. One of them is right in downtown Providence, on an old abandoned, warehouse site. So those kinds of things are beginning to happen, and hopefully we'll see more of them.
Is that Gotham Greens, Scott, you're referring
Yes.
to? For anybody that wants to look it up? Yeah.
Yeah, to your point, Bevan, I think that there needs to be nothing short of a complete regulatory revolution around food. Zoning is just the start of that. Our health regulations they don't serve us. And that really needs to change. People be able to need to grow and process their own food. There needs to be an economy that is much more slick and streamlined around this. It's going to take a lot of work. So I couldn't agree more. I do want to not lose the point of school children. School children is, we talked about the 40S up in Massachusetts, where they said, well, if you can demonstrate you've had a disproportionate impact from school kids based on your 40R development, we'll compensate you for that. I don't know the hard number, but I'm gonna, throw a number out there that I think is reasonable. I'd say that probably less than 5% of the communities who have implemented 40R have successfully applied for the mitigation funds related to school kids. It just doesn't happen.
Because they couldn't demonstrate that they were having increased costs.
Yeah, no, they just didn't bother. There's nothing to suggest that.
It's a huge urban legend and suburban legend.
Most school systems are suffering from dropping enrollments and would love to have more kids. There are a few towns out there whose schools are at capacity, and it's probably worth looking at this issue, but they are the exception.
Nate, just to follow up on the comment you made before about the need for significant regulatory reform, do you want to just say a word about the Land Use Commission, which is getting underway?
Yeah, and we haven't even thought about food. But so the Land Use Commission, I don't remember the exact date, but suffice to say, it's been decades since Rhode Island's land use legislation has had a comprehensive look. And what many of you know is that with local zoning or with state legislation, what happens is that you put the new one in, and then over time you amend and you chip away, and then eventually things just get confusing and it doesn't work well anymore. And we're at that point. It's probably been a couple of decades. It's time to take a
30 years roughly, Nate.
yeah.
About 30 years.
So it's time to take a fresh look, and that's what this commission is going to look at. The language in the legislation is very vague. It basically says the full universe of legislation that deals with land use. I can guarantee you we can't do that because then you're talking about DEM, CRMC, and all of that stuff that goes into that licensing. But zoning, subdivision, and the Comprehensive Planning Act are going to be at the forefront of what this commission looks at. And I do think that there will have to be some look at what DEM and CRMC do as well, just to make sure that at least the mechanics and the process of any changes that are made at the local level work with the mechanics and the processes that are in operation at the state level to make that happen.
And Nate has been appointed to that commission, and it gets underway with its first meeting very soon, doesn't it?
That's already happened.
It already happened. Okay.
2 meetings. So we've taken flight. Yep.
Okay.
And just FYI, I'm a member of the Low Mod Income Housing Commission. So we're in there pitching.
So that concludes our time. I mean, obviously, we just got to the tip of the iceberg with some of the discussions on these innovative land use efforts. I want to thank GrowSmart Rhode Island, Scott and his staff, and the consultants for helping us and guiding us through all 4 of these workshops. It's been really great to discuss these issues, and we need to obviously discuss them deeper. And so you will be getting an email from us with potential next steps that any of you as engaged residents of Aquidneck Island can take on any of these land use issues. And we really do hope that everyone will become more involved in creating the community they want to see in the future on Aquidneck Island. So thank you everyone for coming tonight, and hopefully we can talk more about land use in the future. And again, Scott, thank you and your staff.
And thank you, Chuck, for being at the cutting edge of innovative approaches to maintaining community character while allowing for necessary growth. So kudos to you and your great team too.
Great, thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Good
Thank you.
night.